Hey, everybody. Welcome to Ministry Mondays with Meg. I'm Meg. I'm Reverend Meg Biddle. I currently serve as the National Coordinator of Ministry Life and the American Baptist Personnel Services, as some of us may know as ABPS. And I serve at the American Baptist Home Mission Societies in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. So you either on purpose or by accident, you've found my web show, and welcome. And today I'd like to welcome my guest. I'm going to pull up her title for everybody. Reverend LeDayne McLeese Polaski, who is Executive Director of MeckMIN. And thank you so much, LeDayne, for joining me today for this. For those who don't know about your ministry, would you start off by telling everybody a little bit about you and what you do?
Sure. So in Baptist life, some folks might remember me from the 20 plus years I spent at the Baptist Peace Fellowship of North America, BPFNA, Baptist Pour La Paz. Bautistas Pour La Paz. Haven't said that one for a while. And about 3.5 years ago, I transitioned into a new position. I am the Executive Director of Mecklenburg Metropolitan Interfaith Network, which we call MeckMIN. So it's here in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina.
Okay. And so from my Google knowledge, which
Google knows all.
Right, exactly. So I got that that you serve like 12 different types of faith communities. So what is MeckMIN? What does it do?
Sure. So we have actually, there are 9 different faith groups that are part of MeckMIN. So it's Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Unitarian Universalist, Science of Mind. Wait a minute. I forgot 2 of them. Unitarian Universalist. I forgot one. Anyway, 9 different faith groups. And Buddhist and Baha'i. Those are the 2 I forgot.
Okay.
And so my elevator speech is that all of our faiths, all of those faiths have as a key principle, love of neighbor. And but it's hard to love well a neighbor that you don't know well. And so our work is all about introducing neighbors to each other.
Well, that's fantastic.
Pretty cool.
That is really cool. That you can have all those faith communities coming together, and no matter your name for the Almighty Creator, that you can love your neighbor alongside each other. That's beautiful.
Great.
So what do you guys? What do you do? Is it yeah?
So we have a number of programs and projects, and so we have. We do a project called Open Tables where we have a potluck meal together. You'll be glad to know that potlucks are an interfaith thing.
Right. Not just the Baptists.
Right. Baptist. So we invite people to bring a vegetarian meal, vegetarian entree to share. And because that helps like all kind of different dietary restrictions from different faith groups. And we come together and we have a meal and we sit around tables in small groups and have guided discussions. And it could be anything from, we did one on Tribalism 101, which is basically like how you define in-groups and out-groups and what it feels like in your in-group and what it feels like when you're the out-group. And we did one on forgiveness, which was great, getting kind of these different perspectives. And we always are finding, what are the ways that we're similar and what are the ways that we're different and how do we live well with each other with both of those things. So we do those. We do basically a college version of that same project called Potlucks for Pluralism, which is, we got a great grant from the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations to fund that. We'll be doing it for 4 years, bringing there are a lot of colleges in our area. So 6 of those colleges are coming together a couple of times a semester to have conversations among students who orient towards religion and worldview differently. We have a youth program, so we bring youth together throughout the year to sometimes they're educational programs, sometimes they're service projects. We have one coming up that I'm super excited about. We did it last year and it was just amazing, where we have an interfaith youth panel. So high schoolers kind of talking about their faiths and how their faith shapes their life and ways that they find their faith beautiful and helpful and affirming, and ways that they might encounter discrimination and difficulty based on their faith. So last year it was just absolutely incredible. I was blown away by how articulate and amazing these teenagers were, and how respectful and curious the teenagers were who were listening to them. So we do all kind of projects with youth through the year. We have a women's book club that meets once a month and reads different books and talks together. We have service projects. I always like for the service projects to help people see something that they might not otherwise know, like some reality that they might not be aware of. So we have one coming up. Charlotte, like a lot of cities, is receiving a lot of people directly from the US-Mexico border. And many of them are showing up here with no contacts. They don't have a sponsor. They don't have family. They don't have friends. They have nothing. And they're literally getting off at the bus station and thinking, what do we do now? And so we're working with the Latin American Coalition here to figure out ways that the faith community can be supportive. So our first volunteer event of this year is going to be helping them with a resource fair. And so one, we will be the volunteers for the resource fair, but two, like every time we're talking about that project, we're making people aware of the fact that people are coming and that they're going to need our support. And so service projects, I'm trying to think what else. We have a big awards breakfast every year where we honor people in the community who are doing the work of bridge building. We try to kind of get beyond the usual suspects and maybe lift up some people who are not well known in the community and really celebrate what they're doing. Was super fun last year. The two award winners were both people who probably 99.9% of people in Mecklenburg County had never heard of before, but they're doing great work. And it was so cool to kind of lift that up and honor them. And we do a Thanksgiving service every year that's for the whole community, that's interfaith. This past year in 2022, we did Indigenous focus. We have several tribes who are local to our area, and they helped us with the planning, and were the people who spoke and played and during the service. And it was amazing because, their experience of Thanksgiving and the Thanksgiving story is completely different from how people who are not Indigenous might have experienced it. And it was so amazing. It was really cool to work with them to put it together and to watch how it came about. So I think I mentioned everything, but it's all just about like who are our neighbors and how do we get to know each other and love each other and support each other and serve our greater community together.
Do you struggle at all with acceptance, from do you struggle at all helping those folks find acceptance? I mean, do you get pushback from the community at large? Like,
oh, that's a good question. People kind of self-select if they want to do our work. So people who are not interested in that generally don't show up. But I think what we get more than anything is people just don't know. So I quote a lot a 80-year-old who's an active participant in our Open Tables project. And so at one of our events, like the opening question was, what's your hometown and what do you love about it? And her quip was, I grew up in a small town in North Carolina. It's called Charlotte. And if you live in North Carolina, that's a hilarious line because we now have 2.2 million people in our metro area. Okay. But when she was born 80 years ago, there were 100,000 people living in Charlotte, North Carolina. So in her lifetime, we've gone from 100,000 people to over 2 million people. And the degree of diversity that has come to this city in that time is phenomenal and overwhelming. And I think it leads to a richer community, but also it means that there's a lot of work to get to know each other.
Yeah.
So I don't I don't generally get pushback, but I do get people say, if I talk about like, the Sikh temple, like at one of our youth programs, I said something about the Sikh temple, and one of the teenagers goes, "You mean like a hospital?" And I'm like, "No, no, not Sikh, S-I-C-K, Sikh, S-I-K-H." And he'd never heard of it before, which is, I think he's hardly alone in that. So I think more than pushback, we just get people who don't know. But then part of the fun part is like when you make those introductions, I think people are genuinely excited and curious. And so, like, both of our most recent youth programs, we did one where we were packing backpacks for refugee children. And then another one where we visited the Sikh Gurdwara and had lunch with them and participated in worship. And afterwards, it was so interesting because both times, as I was kind of chatting with one of the youth who'd come and participated, they both said almost the same exact thing, which was, I had no idea so many different kinds of people lived in Charlotte. And they were super excited to find it out. So not a whole lot of pushback. I'm sure there are people out there who are not into interfaith work, but they mostly just don't come.
I love when hearts are open and eyes are opened, and there's that moment where they're just like, yeah, I really didn't know.
Right.
That was one of the favorite things I ever did with my congregation in upstate New York. Was I had another Baptist pastor and a rabbi and a Sikh come, and they all did part of the service.
Oh, cool.
And then they stayed afterwards for conversation. And here I had this congregation of mostly old people, and they'd never experienced anything like this before in their lives. And they stayed and they were engaged. And so, part of it is us letting go of our own, oh, what are they going to think when I suggest this? And yeah, there were a couple who thought it was a terrible idea. That's okay. They didn't come that day. And everyone else enjoyed it and was like, that Jewish storyteller was the coolest, what was so cool was they all took the same story and told it in their own way.
Oh, interesting. That sounds
cool. So it was great to hear it from three different perspectives.
Well, and that's the kind of thing that I mostly get, where people are so interested, where it was like, they walk away from an event saying, I had no idea. I had no idea we had this thing that's very similar. But also, like, I had no idea that we thought differently about this thing, right? So I always tell people, if you can come with respect and curiosity, that's all you really need to have a great experience.
So now that we're hopefully in the endemic part, and stay that way kind of thing. So because what you said, you'd been there, how long? 3?
I started in October of 2019. So my joke is I was just getting my feet on the ground when the ground disappeared.
No, that's great.
So it's been an interesting time.
So were you guys able to do anything at all during?
Oh, yeah. Actually, one of the things I forgot to mention that we do actually started during the pandemic, because of the pandemic. So early March 2020, I got a phone call from one of our pastors, and she said, that virus that we keep hearing about is coming here. And like every crisis, it's going to hit the most vulnerable first, hardest, and longest. And And she said, I want the faith community to be united in our response. And so we thought, and I kind of have to laugh at our naivete at that point, where it's like, well, let's have a face-to-face meeting and talk about this virus. And so we kind of put a call out to our faith leaders, to some of the main nonprofits in town, and invited them to meet in one of our church sanctuaries, and had somebody from the health department come. And so I'm basically saying, okay, how do you see this impacting your work? And so like the biggest group that works with people experiencing homelessness was like, well, if we're kind of hearing this thing from the CDC about people being 6 feet apart, and if that ends up being something that we do, that's obviously going to impact the number of people we can house in our shelters, but we're kind of still figuring it out. And so we had a meeting. We're like, well, let's meet again next week. And between that face-to-face meeting and the next meeting, like our governor had like put a stop to face-to-face meetings.
Yeah.
And so they were like, hey, have y'all heard of this thing called Zoom? So for 18 months, we had a meeting every single Thursday morning where we had faith leaders and nonprofit leaders and community leaders. And pretty quickly we diversified. So beyond like the big we have 3 or 4 big nonprofits that do a lot of work, but we also have a ton of grassroots nonprofits. And so we just came together every single week to ask what's happening right now and how can the faith community be a part. And I kind of thought that when the pandemic ended, which was a thing that I thought was going to happen,
right,
that the meetings wouldn't be necessary anymore. But what we found is like, it's really filling this niche where there are so many nonprofits and there are so many faith communities. They don't know each other and they don't necessarily know what the others are doing. And so now we do it every other week, but I suspect we'll be doing this forever because it's really helpful just to kind of have that regular opportunity to ask ourselves, what's happening? What's going on right now? How can we get resources for our members, and how can we use our resources well for our neighbors? One of the stories that I love that came out of that, when I mentioned that in order to love our neighbors well, we have to know them well. So early on in the pandemic, Refugee Support Services, which is this great group here in town, came to us. And like, do you remember the coin shortage where like early in the pandemic, you'd go into a business and it would be exact change only or credit cards only. So they came to us and said, the immigrant families that we work with live in apartment complexes, and almost all of those complexes have coin operated laundries. So they couldn't do their clothes. And so we did an interfaith quarter drive. And this was like in the worst of the pandemic, where almost nobody was worshiping in person. And so like all these congregations in town had their clergy stand outside, and their congregation members would come by and drop off a little bag of quarters. And I just love that image because it's so specific. When it was such a specific way of loving our refugee neighbors. And so now it's like, it's a little of everything. So we met yesterday. There's a really hard local story where the day after Christmas, there's an apartment complex for senior adults, mostly low income. And there was a water main break in the building the day after Christmas. They had to evacuate really quickly. They couldn't take their things with them. So we were sharing like, here's the thing here, they need toiletries, they need clothes. So it may be like a really specific need like that we're making people aware of, or it may be a bigger issue. I mean, like the people arriving from the southern border that I mentioned, like that's a big ongoing issue that we're bringing up every week and talking about, how do we help people find resources, get resources. So that's kind of one of the big things we did throughout the pandemic that I feel really good about. I think it had a lot of impact, continues to have a lot of impact. But then most everything else we did by Zoom. So you can't have a potluck by Zoom, but you can have a conversation. And so we that went really well. We did our big events on Facebook Live. I kind of laugh because like when I first got here, I kept telling my board, I can't wait till I'm a year in and I've seen everything. But the truth was it was something more like 3 years in when I had seen everything, because like we did our awards breakfast twice on Facebook Live. And then when we were doing it in person, I was like, how does this work? Like, which felt kind of funny after 3 years to not know how one of our major programs works. But no, actually we did quite a lot during the pandemic. And it was a great way of sort of getting to know more people in the community than we had known beforehand. So it actually ended up for us being a really fruitful time.
So I know you said earlier that you received a grant. Is that how all your funding, or the majority of your funding, comes
No,
from?
actually, most of our funding comes from local congregations and then local individuals who are just interested in our work and want to support it. We do get some grant funding, but the vast majority comes from congregations and individuals.
Oh, okay. Well, that surprises me, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
a wonderful thing to have a community that embraces the work that you're doing and says, "Here, let me support you," and you're not going, "Okay, are we going to be able to keep the lights on?"
right.
Thing. Are we going to be able to continue to help? That's beautiful. So, what would you say is your biggest need? Is it with that immigrant community?
That's a good question. Certainly, right. Well, actually, let me step back. Charlotte is one of many communities that has a huge issue with affordable housing. And then that impacts every other thing we care about. So one of the things that makes it hard when immigrant families get here is nobody has housing. So some of the, we as an organization don't do direct service, except for our, quarterly service projects. But what we try to do is to, make people aware and help people connect and help groups that are working on similar issues come together. And kind of leverage what we can to make a difference. So, so that's a huge ongoing issue. And then there are other things, transportation, education, all the big things that any big urban community struggles with, we struggle with. And but like, so for affordable housing, for instance, we did a project, and this was during the pandemic, so it was on Zoom, where we invited, I think, 5 different congregations that have 5 different models of creating affordable housing. And it was great. And the feedback I got was almost universally, even from those who were involved in their own efforts, of saying, I had no idea so many congregations were doing so much. And so it was just really heartening for people, I think, to see that so much was happening and that there were so many different ways of doing it. So like one congregation is, actually building affordable housing on their campus. Another one sold some property that they no longer need for like $1 to Habitat for Humanity. And they are developing that property for Habitat. And one of the houses that's built the congregation will be able to use for ministry purposes. So I think just kind of opening up people's imaginations of different ways of doing things. And so there are lots and lots of big issues. I would say the other big issue from our perspective, kind of harkening back to something I said before, the growth here in Charlotte has been so big, so fast that, we've really gone from having a city where probably 95% of the population was Christian, to having a population where that's just not true anymore. And there's just a lot of, not necessarily ill will, but people just don't know. And so, pretty much every non-Christian member of my board, every non-Christian person who's involved has a story or multiple stories of, my Muslim friend whose kids came home with Christmas trees to color from school, or there was a local group here in town that, with the best of intentions, was trying to welcome when we had an influx of people coming from Afghanistan, and one of the local groups wanted to be helpful, and they planned this big resource fair with food trucks and trying to kind of have like pretty much all the different things you would need to know if you're a newcomer to Charlotte. And but there were two issues. One is that they planned it at a big church, and whereas here, like, we have good relationships between the Muslim community and the Christian community, but if you're coming directly from Afghanistan, being invited to a church probably doesn't feel super welcoming. And they planned it on the first Saturday of Ramadan.
Oh,
right. They were trying to do a good thing, but they just didn't know. Right. And so I think that's the other challenge here. We've done some training in school systems, and I reached out to the biggest local school system here to ask, like, do you think there's a role for us? And her response is, who I would love for you to train is the attendance secretaries, because she said about once a week I get an email or a phone call from an attendance secretary saying, is blah, blah, blah a real religious holiday? Right. So some Baha'i kid has come in and said, I missed this day because it's a major religious holiday. And the attendance secretary has literally never heard of it before. She may never have even heard of Baha'i before. And so I think that's the other big thing, is just kind of helping people to know. The vast majority of people, once they know, are going to be welcoming and inclusive. But until
Yeah.
You're the sweet teacher who doesn't understand why coloring Christmas trees isn't great for everybody.
Right. That's one of the things I do appreciate about living in Pennsylvania, the school district where my child attends. Yeah, they observe Christmas, but we also observe Eid, and they have all the holidays in there.
And I think one of the things that's super interesting about Charlotte is that you're there in the greater Philadelphia area. That's been a diverse place for a long time. If you're in Detroit or LA or New York or Boston, you've been diverse for a long time. It's just not true for us. Like this, the increase in diversity is pretty new. And so there's just a lot people don't know. And that I feel like we can help them to know and appreciate and do a better job of being good neighbors.
Yeah. Living in the Midwest, no, not so much.
Right? Yeah. And it's not because, and I did a training for the Rock Hill school system, which is just over the border in South Carolina. And, and we were mentioning we had like an interfaith panel, and they were talking about either their experiences in the school system or their kids or their grandkids. And you could tell that some of the teachers were kind of really feeling bad, realizing that they had done some of these things. And I told them, I was like, look, probably like me, you grew up in the Christian monoculture, right? I think I had my entire life, I knew of two friends who were anything other than Christian. And I was like, that's not your fault, right? That's where we are.
Right.
And if you don't understand the ins and outs of Islam, that's
okay. Yeah.
That's not something that you should feel like bad about. But now that we are more diverse, and now that we do have lots more neighbors, now it is incumbent upon us to learn more, so that we can be more welcoming, make our classrooms more inclusive, make our companies more inclusive. I spoke at the Rotary a couple months ago, and I don't know if you know who Diana Eck is. She's a professor.
I do. I've read the book.
Yeah, she talks about the difference between diversity and
Yeah.
pluralism. And so one of the examples is, diversity just is. Diversity is knowing that you have employees who are lots of different faiths. Pluralism is thinking through the menu of the company picnic with that in mind. And so I mentioned this at the Rotary Club, and a woman came up to me afterwards, and so she's Baha'i, and has friends who are Jain, who are very strict vegetarians, and talks about, all the times that they go into places and there's literally nothing to eat. And so I think, there's just so many different ways in which that with just a little bit of knowledge, you can be so much more welcoming and inclusive. And so I think that's just a huge challenge for us, particularly with the really rapid pace of change here, and how many people just haven't had an opportunity to learn more.
Yeah. So let's say we've got somebody watching us and says, okay, I want to learn how to become a better neighbor.
Sure.
Where do they start?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, there is a great interfaith group in Philadelphia. So if they're right there, they can look out there. There's a pretty good network of interfaith groups. So in all likelihood, there's somebody working on that in your area. So that would be my first stop, is somebody local already doing this? There's a great group called Interfaith America. It used to be Interfaith Youth Corps. They have great resources, great. I haven't been because of COVID, but I understand their annual conference is really good. I would just, start reaching out, see what's out there. You can hop on our website, which is just MeckMIN.org. We have a section called Interfaith 101, which is just sort of like some super basic understanding of the faith groups that are part of us. So I think, just start looking and try to see if you can find out who's in your area. And if there's not an interfaith group in your area, start thinking about what you can do. I mean, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be anything huge. I mean, you can call the local rabbi and meet with him and her and see, what they might be interested in, or, if there's a mosque, right? Make a personal contact and see if there are things you can do together.
Yeah. And if we have folks that would want to support the ministry that you're doing there, can they donate on your website?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yes, of course.
Okay. So I'll put a link.
No, that'd be great. Yeah, it's just MeckMIN.org, and there's a donate button on the website. We obviously that's always a huge help.
That's what this is about for me.
No, that's great. I mean, the pandemic has had an impact on the finances, so we would love that. Yeah. So sure.
Okay. I'll be sure to put the link for folks. And am I missing anything in this conversation? Like,
is
there something like we really need to know?
I guess I would think like the thing that comes to mind is like not to make assumptions, because it's interesting to me that some of the groups that I thought I kind of had a good read on, or that I understood pretty well, are so much more nuanced and complicated and interesting than I thought. And I think that's one of the things, just sociologically speaking, we see any group that we're a part of, like we can see the diversity within that group, but we tend to look at other groups as like monoliths, like, and we may not say it out loud, but somewhere in our head, there's this idea of like, all Muslims are pretty much the same. Right. And I actually have this story that I tell, which it's kind of embarrassing to me, but it's also interesting where, you know, you don't even recognize your own prejudices until they get presented to you, and then you're like, oh yeah, that's a thing I need to work on. Um, so we have a board member who's of the Sikh faith, and at a December board meeting, he came to a meeting with a bright red turban and a T-shirt that made him look like an elf. And I just laughed and laughed and laughed and laughed. I just thought it was so funny. But I realized that part of what made it funny was that I just didn't know enough South Asian men to realize that, like, of course, some of them are funny and have senses of humor, right? Many of them are funny and have senses of humor. And it just took me by such surprise. And then it's also interesting too, like I'll have conversations with somebody and I'm just sure that I know what they think about a certain issue. And then I have a conversation with them. I'm like, oh, that's not what I would have expected or not what I would have believed. And sometimes their position is like more conservative than I would have thought. Sometimes it's more open than I would have thought. So I think just like be willing to be curious and respectful and to be surprised. I learn new stuff all the time.
And it's great, isn't it? I mean,
it is. Like I tell people I am 55 years old and I love the fact that my job requires me to learn all the time.
Yeah. It's really great. And yeah, I know that you can be nervous and things like that when you're just getting your feet wet, but for me it is just it's life-giving, and
Sure.
just to learn about where people come from and what they've faced to get to where they are now. They have incredible stories, and 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 they just are such a blessing, to, sh-
And
to
yeah.
share that.
And I think one of the things that sometimes people want to avoid interfaith work because they think it means watering down what they believe. And that's actually not it at all. I mean, obviously you come in respectful, and you know we have a rule. You know, we don't proselytize, but that doesn't mean that I can't walk into a room and say I'm Christian, and as a Christian, this story is important to me, or this thing is important to me, or this holiday is important to me. And I one of the programs that we did just before the pandemic, December of 2019, we had a panel where we had Jewish, Christian, and Muslim perspectives on Jesus, and it was so interesting because the Jewish cantor who spoke, basically his presentation were, here are 5 ways in which Jesus was very orthodox in his Judaism, and here are 3 ways in which he wasn't. And not as a critique, but just as like, here it is. And as a Christian, I found it so helpful because like one of the different ones was forgiveness. And it made me, I walked away as a Christian with a better understanding of Christian forgiveness than I had ever had before. And it was because of this conversation with the cantor, right? And so I think, you know, you can bring your full self to interfaith work. You can bring your full devotion to your own faith, and have that in interaction with other people. And there's just a richness there that's kind of hard to explain. I was writing a fundraising letter in December, and I wrote the words, "I can no longer imagine my life without MeckMIN." And what I really meant is I can't imagine my life without these relationships that I have now. And they're across the religious continuum. You know, I have friends now who are way more conservative than I am. And then I have friends who just think about, who orient towards religion, you know, conservative and progressive don't even begin to like apply. So yeah, I really can't imagine my life without this anymore.
And you're a better person because of it, you know.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I know Google is a great search engine, you know, the almighty prophet Google. You know, I would encourage people to Google more about you and some of these additional interviews you've done. If you don't mind, I'll put links to
Oh yeah,
to
that'd be great.
Okay. That YouTube, I found that one very interesting about the faith and political polarization, and you've got stuff in Baptist News Global and all sorts of things. So I'm happy to put those links out there
That'd be
for folks, and as well as the MeckMIN website link.
cool.
So as we kind of wrap up, it comes that joy question, my favorite question. So you can consider all you do. What brings you joy?
You warned me this was coming, and I should
I
be
know,
ready.
and it doesn't have to be the work. I mean,
Right.
I've had dance dancer playing in the park, with my kids.
I think what brings me joy is having a conversation and going a lot deeper with somebody than I expected, or having the conversation just go a completely different direction than I expected, and having it kind of just really shift my perspective. And that happens to me a lot now, where I kind of think I've got it, and then I'll have a conversation and realize, like, oh, there's this whole other dimension that I hadn't gotten before. And then I would also mention, it's just this is one of those things that, like, it starts sad but it gets better. So there are two Sikh Gurdwaras here in Charlotte, and one of them has recently experienced 4 different episodes of vandalism. And so they reached out to me a couple of weeks ago to tell me about it, and to say, we have this GoFundMe campaign. We're trying to build a security fence because obviously this is an issue. And so I put the word out among the interfaith community, and it was just so heartening to go into because on the GoFundMe, you can see who's donated. And I'm like, oh, I know that Buddhist. I know that Baha'i. I know that Christian. I know that synagogue, right? And to have all those people from all those different perspectives really surrounding this community with love and care and practical support. And so then, I got a text from one of the Sikh leaders who said, this is, these incidents have been very upsetting to our congregation, obviously, but the support we've gotten from the interfaith community has been so heartening. And so I think, when we can make the connections to make that happen, where it's both a community getting practical support, but also just that emotional, spiritual sense of we're not alone, right? That there is a larger community that's embracing us and taking care of us. That really does bring me an immense amount of joy.
And for what it's worth, I have to say that you can tell that you love what you do, because when you talk about your work, you can hear the love, and you can hear the passion coming from you. So
it really is great work. I feel very grateful to be doing it.
I am grateful for you, for the work that you do, and for sharing your time. I'll put all sorts of links underneath this, and share it with our viewers. And I thank everybody for watching. And Reverend LeDayne McLeese Polaski, thank you so much for sharing MeckMIN with me and the audience, and with most importantly with Charlotte.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate it. This has been fun.
Good. I'm so glad. All right. Thanks everybody for watching.